Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Incarnational Inkwell podcast. I am your host, Adam Lacrosse, and this is the show where we dive deeper into literature in order to create a better relationship with Jesus Christ. So last episode we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and now continuing on through our survey of ancient world literature, I want to shift our attention to Greece. Greece, of course, especially in this time period, has the bulk of kind of the literary weight, culturally speaking, so we'll learn a lot about kind of Greek culture, especially through our discussion of the Iliad today, and kind of how their perceptions of war and the reasons behind it can kind of influence and shape our modern Catholic Christian perception of the reasons behind why we go to war. So, the Iliad. A little bit of background first. What does the word Iliad mean? I was actually surprised to find, and this makes sense, that the word Iliad comes from the name Ilium, which is another name for Troy. So, the epic known as the Iliad, and remember an epic is just basically a long narrative poem about a big important subject, usually a great central hero. In this case, I would argue that that central hero is Achilles. The Iliad is about the Trojan War, because Troy is Ilium, so that makes sense. It was written by Homer, a blind poet. Now, according to archaeological finds, the Trojan War actually did take place. It was an actual war that happened in Greece around the 12th century BC, from what I could find, and Homer actually, quote-unquote, wrote. He didn't really write. There wasn't much for writing back then. He composed this orally, but he wrote it in the 8th century BC. So this is kind of a little bit of a fictitious retelling of an actual war, according to my research. We actually pick up when the Iliad starts. The Trojan War has been going on for about 10-ish years. So before we jump into the text itself, I want to give a little bit of a prologue as far as why the war started, according to the myth and the legend, so that'll give us greater context for things going forward. So there was a man named Paris, and he was invited to a great party hosted by the gods of Mount Olympus, the Greek gods, and Eris, the goddess of discord, she just likes to cause trouble. Of course, she's the goddess of discord, the goddess of chaos, goddess of strife. So she took a golden apple and she etched into the apple the words, "For the fairest," and she tossed it into the crowd, and the apple landed at the feet of three goddesses: Hera, the queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Now, of course, Zeus being the king of the gods, you'd think that would be kind of his prerogative. He would be the one to kind of settle this dispute. But he also knew that Hera had a big temper, and being the queen of the gods, she had about as much power as he did. So Zeus kind of bows out of making the judgment. He passes that judgment on to Paris. So Paris meets with the three women, and he will decide kind of who is the fairest goddess among the three of them. In order to help him decide, each goddess offers him something if he selects her. Hera offers that Paris would rule all of Europe and Asia, being the queen of the gods. She kind of has a large influence within government, and so she can give him control over those geographical regions. Athena, being the goddess of both war and wisdom, this will come up later in the epic poem, she offers Paris just an incredible amount of wisdom in battle. He will rarely be defeated because he's just so tactical, such a good warrior, can think on his feet. But Aphrodite offers him the hand of Helen of Sparta. She says that if Paris gives the golden apple to Aphrodite, she will make sure that Paris marries Helen of Sparta, who was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world at the time. Of course, Paris, being a very handsome man, and Helen being a very beautiful woman, he accepts Aphrodite's offer and gives the apple to Aphrodite. However, there is one problem. Helen of Sparta is already married to the king of Sparta, a man named Menelaus. So Aphrodite arranges for Helen to basically be kidnapped from Sparta, brought to Troy, where Paris is. Paris is a Trojan. And so Aphrodite uses her love magic and makes Helen fall in love with Paris. And Menelaus is really ticked off because a goddess just kidnapped his wife. So he's like, well, this means war. I'm going to do whatever I can in my power to get my wife back. So with that, it's now time to turn to the opening phrase of the Iliad. The Iliad begins, "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus that was moving toward its end." That's the first chapter of the Iliad, lines 1 through 6. So let's break this down a little bit. So this poem, this entire story of war, is going to be about rage. The rage of one man in particular, Achilles. He is going to slay thousands of Trojans, and his rage will basically not be sated until the war comes to an end. Of course, it mentions the Achaeans. The Achaeans, the code word there is Greek, so it's just another name for the Greeks. So the Achaeans versus the Trojans means the same thing as the Greeks versus the Trojans, just so you can kind of keep track there. And it mentions in the end there the will of Zeus. You know, Zeus is going to be one of the big players in the war. A bunch of gods are going to be kind of taking sides. Some will be favoring the Greeks, some will be favoring the Trojans. But the gods are going to have their own messy hand in the war, their own reasons for fighting and aiding certain sides in the tides of battle. And of course, you know, the gods can only do so much. The gods are still bound by fate, according to Greek myth. So some warriors may not be killed at a certain moment because, according to fate, it is not their time to die. So not even the gods are all-powerful, which is a great contrast to our Christian tradition, where we have the one omnipotent God. With that out of the way, I want to kind of turn to the main character, I think, in all of the Iliad, and that would be Achilles. So who is Achilles? Achilles is a demigod. He is half mortal, half divine. He is the son of a man named Peleus, as mentioned in the opening sentence there, but he's also the son of the sea nymph Thetis. Now, Thetis, like any good mother, wants to care for her child as much as she can, and Achilles being a demigod, Thetis knows that Achilles will have a larger target on his backbeat just because of his half-divine status. So when Achilles was a baby, she took him to the river Styx down in the underworld, and she dipped him into the river Styx as a baby, and that made him invulnerable when his body touched that river water. Unfortunately, obviously she wouldn't drown her baby, so she had to hold him by his heel, and that is where the term the Achilles heel comes from, because as it will be foreshadowed in the final chapters of the epic, someone will actually fire an arrow into Achilles' heel, and that will kill him, because that is the one spot on his body where he is vulnerable. He cannot be attacked otherwise because of the magic of the river Styx. So as the poem opens, he's arguing with Agamemnon, who is King Menelaus' brother. You'll remember King Menelaus. He is the king of Sparta. He is the original husband of Helen, who has been kidnapped by Paris. So Agamemnon and Achilles are arguing because Agamemnon stole a daughter from the priest of Apollo, Chryseis. That was a very common thing to do in the ancient world. When you went and invaded a city, you would be able to take women who are not married and kind of take them as quote-unquote war prizes to do what you wish, have sex with them, and kind of treat them as concubines or sex slaves. And now, of course, Chryseis, the father of this woman who has been taken by Agamemnon, he's upset and he prays to Apollo, and he's like, Apollo, please help me get my daughter back. So Apollo, being the god of both healing and plagues, sends down a plague upon the Greeks, and Achilles is like, Agamemnon, dude, you gotta return this woman. She's the daughter of a priest, and the priest just prayed and we suffered a plague. And Agamemnon's like, well, fine, I'm the general of this army, though, and I need a war prize. So if I give back this woman, I'm going to take your war prize, because Achilles has a war prize, too. He ended up kidnapping a woman, and that was to be considered Achilles' war prize. Agamemnon's like, fine, I'm your general, I'm your officer, I'm the one in control here, so if I can't have my own war prize, I'm going to steal your war prize. And Achilles is like, no, you're not. If you're going to steal my war prize, I don't want to fight in this war anymore. So he actually just decides to basically book it out of the story until the very end, and just refuses to fight. And, of course, Achilles, being such a proud and tactical warrior, him having this invulnerable body, the Greeks start losing because Achilles is not fighting with them. If Achilles were fighting with them, they would do a lot better, but the Greeks are losing just because Achilles is not on their side. I'm kind of skipping a lot of the story, because a lot of the story is just a bunch of battles, a bunch of tactics. Various gods intervene, like I said, some on each side, but the main crux of the action, the main climax, comes toward the end of the poem, when Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, is killed by a Trojan warrior named Hector. Patroclus was very distraught that Achilles was not fighting. He wanted to boost morale amongst the Greeks, so Patroclus basically stole Achilles' armor and pretended to be Achilles, and he got himself killed by Hector, who was a Trojan. Achilles is very distraught. Patroclus was his best friend, and he is so sad that he's dead, and so he ends up mourning for many days, but he comes out to the battlefield. He tells Agamemnon, he's like, fine, I will fight just to avenge Patroclus. Point me in the direction of Hector. He gets some magic armor, a magic spear, even a magic shield from the gods, and goes and just brutally eviscerates Hector. He murders him, and not only that, he ties up the body of Hector and drags it around the city of Troy in a chariot, just to basically mock this great Trojan warrior. And he is just having a field day. All of the Trojans come out to mourn Hector, because Hector was their greatest warrior. But Achilles is having none of it. He even hosts games as part of Hector's funeral. There are archery contests and all sorts of things that happen as part of Hector's quote-unquote funeral. So there's a lot of gloating within the end of this war as this great Trojan warrior is taken down. Now, of course, soon after Hector dies, King Priam, Hector's father, the king of Troy, comes out to Achilles and begs. He's like, please, I know you killed my son. I know my son killed your best friend, but please just let me have his body. And so Achilles, recognizing that King Priam is basically just like him. King Priam lost someone very dear to him, just like Achilles did. So he gives Hector's body to King Priam, and they mourn together. They have a little dinner, and they mourn their losses, and that is how the story ends. A lot of fighting, a lot of blood, a lot of gore, very visceral descriptions of just war, and they were all doing this for honor and glory. That's the main point of the war. There's all this petty background stuff about women being kidnapped, and things are unfair because women are the property of men, are supposedly the property of these men, but in the end, it's a good contrast between our modern conception of honor and the ancient world's conception of honor. I think for them, in the ancient world, honor was just more about fame. There was no real virtue attached to it. Being famous as far as in battle was a virtue in and of itself. It didn't matter whether you were a quote-unquote pious man or holy man. It just mattered as far as being a warrior, you know, how many kills you got, how many battles you won. And I think it's safe to say that, at least from a Christian perspective, I can only consider Achilles to be honorable and virtuous when he gives King Priam Hector's body, when he makes his peace with Patroclus. Patroclus' ghost visits him in a dream and kind of tells him that things are going to be all right, tells him that he can give King Priam Hector's body because Patroclus is safe in the afterlife. So that raises, for me, I think, a deeper question about our world today as Christians. We have goals, and what are we kind of fighting for? Going back to Gilgamesh from last episode, Gilgamesh just wanted immortality. Achilles just wants honor in battle. But, of course, being Christians, we know that our highest priority is to our relationship with Christ and our relationship with God. So where can we find honor? I think we can find it by being saints. You know, Fulton Sheen said, the only real tragedy in this world is to not be a saint. And sainthood, as great as that is, it far exceeds what the Greeks considered to be, quote-unquote, honor, especially within battle. You know, Christians can go to war, but there has to be a good reason for that war. That's why we have our doctrine of the just war theory, is that we need to be striving for peace, and only after all measures of peace have been exhausted, then we can go to war. Because we know we're fighting war in terms of justice, for a just cause. This is an act of justice that we're going to war, not for some petty reason of kidnapping women and and forcing them to become our concubines, you know. So there's a lot I could say about that, but I think that's kind of the main nugget. Otherwise I would go on a ramble for a little bit. But that's kind of to me the essence of the Christian view of honor, especially within battle. Now, before I wrap up, I do want to make a quick mention. There are two lesser characters that make appearances in the Iliad that we will be discussing further on. One of them is Odysseus, and Odysseus will get his own sequel. Homer will craft the tale of the Odyssey, which is, I would consider, kind of the sequel to the Iliad, and so we'll discuss that next time. And then there's also Aeneas. He is kind of a Trojan, one of the last surviving Trojans, that goes and sails from Troy and ends up kind of helping establish the city of Rome according to the Aeneid. We'll also be discussing the Aeneid later. So just wanted to let you know that those two characters pop up in the Iliad, and their stories will be expanded upon, and I will be expanding upon their stories in the podcast after I finish reading the Odyssey and the Aeneid. So, yeah, that's kind of it. The Iliad was kind of a whirlwind for me, first time reading through. A lot of battle, a lot of war, and just all sorts of blows back and forth, a lot of war strategy. Not much character development, I don't think, until the very end with Achilles, kind of his conversion of being upset about Agamemnon to being upset about Patroclus, and finally to kind of having peace with Priam and giving over Hector's body. So that's all I've got. Please drop a like. Please subscribe to the podcast. And if you've read the Iliad, if you want to kind of give your own thoughts on the Iliad, maybe you disagree with me in my conception of Greek honor versus Christian honor, put a comment down below in the YouTube comment section, or on Spotify. You can listen to it there, and I think there's a way to send comments in Spotify as well. So everyone, have a great day, and God bless.